So here we are standing in front of the temple or the house of the god of metalworking, Hephaestus. And before we try and unpack the genealogy of the Doric order, we're first going to make sense of this kind of building itself. Perhaps the first thing to note is that unlike the sacred settings for ritual that you studied in the first semester, this is not a building that one is supposed to enter. What you're seeing now in front of you is a backdrop to the more sacred space, which is outside under the sky, namely the altar. So in a typical Hellenic temenos, the altar is the most sacred space, and behind it would stand the temple, the house of the god. So one can, in a way, understand the temple as a rational veil that covers the icon of the god, peeking out from behind the darkness. So the temple facade sits between the world of men, the world of physical things, and luachos. The luachos being the unseen, rational order of the universe. And it is the Greeks' notion that there is such an invisible order in the universe that can be discovered and represented with numbers that really gives us a clue as to how they went about designing these temples. And before we get to the detail of how they achieved this rational veil, let's first go through some basic vocabulary. We will get into some more detailed vocabulary as we go along, but it's good to start with some basics. So something you already know is the column. And the column consists of two parts. The capital, which is the head, as in decapitate, or the head city is called the capital city of a country. And then beneath that is the shaft. And of course, these two things together is the column. We're going to refer constantly to the width of the base of the column. So we're going to refer to that as the lower diameter. Then you will see the column has a number of lines that are visible. And what these are, if we had to cut a section through a column, are a series of grooves carved from each drum. And in the Doric order, there would typically be 20 such grooves, more than I've drawn here. That creates a beautiful rhythm of shadow running vertically across. On plan, it would look something like this. And again, there would be 20. and I think I mentioned it when we talked about ancient Egypt, is it helped to hide the joints between the drums. So again, exaggerating, but that's how it would be built, one drum stacked on the other, and then the vertical grooves would help to emphasize the verticality of the column. There's some debate as to whether the fluting mimics older woodworking practices. We'll get back to that argument a bit later. For interest's sake, each drum is fixed to the next one with a wooden square peg that is inserted in a hole cut from the drum, and when the top drum is placed on the one beneath it, the peg swells and it keeps the drum in place. Note that the shaft stands directly on the edge of the step beneath it. There is no gap between the edge of that step and the column itself. Also note that the column does not have any decorative elements or bands at the base. The fluting meets the step directly. Now, this top step on which the column sits is called the stylobate. And whenever you see the word style, you know by now that it refers to column. So it's the basis on which the column stands. The step beneath that is called the stereobate. And again, there may be more than one. And the word is derived from stereos, which refers to solid. That's why when we talk about stereotomic architecture, we talk about solid architecture, where stereotype is a way of identifying people according to an unchangeable, solid set of characteristics. Now, the stereobate and stylobate together form the crepiduoma. So the crepiduoma is the entire base. And the idea of a base is important for the Doric temple and important for our argument of the temple being a rational element, in that one can think of the rocky Greek landscape that we discussed in the previous session and think about how the crepiduoma becomes a means of differentiating the purely ordered, perfect temple from the chaotic, disorderly context. So the establishment of a base is an extremely important step, excuse the pun, in creating a Greek temple. And you will discover later how the setting out of the crepiduoma is mathematically very important. Above the columns is the lintel, and the bottom part is called the architrave. And the decorative band on top of that is called the frieze. And these two elements together is called the entablature. Within the frieze, there are two main subcomponents. The first is this element, which is called a triglyph. And it is so called because of the three grooves that makes up the triglyph. Glyphs refer to the grooves. So you will see, and I'm going to make this point later on, that a lot of what gives the Doric order its quality is the rhythmic repetition of shadows. We don't find planes that are left without any depth. So that's the triglyph, and next to it you will always find a relief, and that part is called a metope. For years I mispronounced this word as metope. So metope. We'll get to some of the detail elements that sit just adjacent to these. The triangular gable of a temple is called a pediment. And it includes the tympanum, and the tympanum is also a relief found within the pediment. The pediment is framed by a raking cornice, which is the diagonal, and a horizontal cornice. And these again, as you can see here on the image, gives a shadow line to frame the pediment, or the tympanum within it rather. Now that you know the main components of the short facade of a Doric temple, let's look at the building in its entirety. The drawing here by Julien David Leroy was drawn in, or at least published in 1770. He was an architect and he had an interest in archaeology, and he travelled on a war ship to Greece to spend a few months with a group of Capuchin monks. And by the way, that's where our word cappuccino comes from. Go and look it up. But he stayed with these monks while measuring a number of ancient and Greek buildings. And his engravings were then published. He was actually criticized by two other authors, whom at the time was well known for their measured drawings of Greek buildings, namely Stuart and Revit. And they were in fact the authors of the previous drawing that you saw. So in the next few explanations, you're going to see drawings by Leroy, although note that there were some small mistakes in it because he didn't believe that complete accuracy was important. He was rather interested in the overall effect, which is quite interesting because that's exactly how the Greeks thought about their architecture. To them it was important that the buildings looked correct, even though they may have some theoretical problems in their setting out. But more about that later. So the first thing to note from this drawing, and obviously this is now a temple in ruin, so you will see that it is covered in plants and it has lost its allure. Or in fact, it has increased its allure to the audience of that time. You will know from first semester that 1770, this is now in the years just before the French Revolution, the Enlightenment thinking was becoming popular, And we were moving towards the age of romanticism in the arts. And it is exactly these kind of encounters with ruined Greek buildings and other ancient structures that made the romantics fall in love with them. But they didn't fall in love with the originals, because the original Greek buildings were actually highly colorful structures, and not the sort of austere, pure stone structures that one thinks of when we think of the ruins of Hellas. So the facade we were looking at earlier is this one. And from this drawing, it is clear, and surely you obviously already know this, that is the short facade, and then it has a long edge to it. And this is typically how one would approach the temple. If we had to look from above, one would often move, and it depended on the temenos, but one would almost move around the building, experiencing it from various angles and experiencing it as a three-dimensional volume in space. And then the route or the procession, which was a public affair, the whole polis, all the citizens would walk from the settlement up a hill, for example, with the animals that are going to be sacrificed. And the whole festive procession would then terminate at the altar, as we said previously. And that's where the sacrifice would occur. That is the main moment of the whole drama. And again, to stress the point that the building is experienced from the outside until one again comes face to face with the rational veil when standing at the altar under the sky. Now, looking at a plan together with the elevation, and you know what an elevation is, I assume, one can identify another few essential elements of a Doric temple. The first one to note is the inner space, that space over there. And that is where the statue of the god was housed. You'll remember that with the Mycenaeans, we talked of an invisible presence. There was no statue of the Mycenaean god that was placed in the Megaron. Here we have a visible presence of the god, a statue of, in this case, it would have been Hephaestus. And the statue would be visible from outside. So one would see the statue, but again, one wouldn't enter the building. Only the priests would enter, and sometimes the temples were used as a treasure house, or important political documents were kept there. So the temples also fulfilled a political role, but again, it was not a space for congregation on the inside. That space is called the nahos. Not nachos, nahos. Another architectural word that we use for these kind of sanctuaries is the cella. The cella would be the Latin derivative from nahos. Now this temple, you will see, and perhaps it even bothers you that it has this back end. If this happens to bother you that it is not on plan symmetrical with the entrance, then you have a Greek mind. So how they resolved this conundrum is they would move the back wall inward. It wouldn't have an entrance because the statue was supposed to only be seen from the altar side and not from this end. So it was a solid wall, unlike over here. But what this allowed them to do was to open up the side. I must imagine that there is no wall. I can't erase the base drawing, unfortunately. But they would then mimic the entrance side. And they would place 2 columns there. And now you can see how obsessed the Greeks were with visual order. And this almost false porch is called an opistou domus, which again does not exist in this temple, but one typically does find it. Surrounding the Naos was a series of 4 colonnades. You know that a colonnade is a series or a line of columns. And because the columns or the colonnades surround the Naos, is all around, one calls this type of temple a peripteral temple. And you will see in your textbooks that there are many types. For instance, if the temple only has columns to the front, then one calls it Prue style. Prue meaning before, so the columns are before the Naos. And there are others as well. But for Doric temples, the most common layout is the peripteral. Now, if we start counting, and we're going to do a lot of counting in the next while, you will see that there are 6 columns on the short side. And that we then call a hexastyle. So there are 2 things to consider when naming a temple. First is the arrangement of the columns in relation to the Naos, in this case peripteral, and then the number of columns on the short end of the temple, in this case 6, therefore a hexastyle. So it's a peripteral hexastyle Doric temple. One last piece of important basic vocabulary refers to the way in which the ends of the Naos walls are articulated. And I'm going to write down this word because it's a very important word when looking at Greek, but actually all ancient architecture. Articulated. So when someone speaks and we say that they articulate well, then we mean that they give a full rounded vocal definition to each word. Where someone who doesn't articulate would be that teenager slouching on the couch that says, yeah, whatever, like what and what, when every word blurs into another. They're not busy articulating their words. And it's interesting how this to me is one of the main differences between contemporary architecture in general and classical architecture is that in classical architecture, there was definitely a clear intention to articulate each building element. Each column is a distinct element, each capital. There is not this tendency, as we see in the work of someone like Zaha Hadid, where the floor becomes the wall, becomes the roof. In classical times, that would have been seen as chaos, not in line with their pursuit for order and harmony. So the ends of these walls are articulated with a pier, and that thickened end is called anta. And when columns here in front, these columns, sit in line with the antae, then we say they are columns in antis. And you can see them here on the elevation as well. Now, how are all of these characteristics and components, what makes this an embodiment of logos? How did the Greeks achieve their need to translate number to aesthetics? Because what we must not think is that the Greeks were so idealistic that they wanted to transcend the physical artifact. Even though Plato talks in those terms, in ancient Greek architecture and art, it is very much about the experience of the visible, which then relates to the invisible. But it was not in the form of some cold abstraction. Now, the most commonly held belief that one would find even amongst the public is that the Greeks used the golden ratio as a means to set out these temples. There are, of course, other theories of even more deeper lying mysteries about how Greek architects embodied the invisible order of the universe. But what I'm going to explain to you now is actually something much more simple and practical than trying to create a building based on incredibly complex math. But nonetheless, I hope you have your math hat on, because of course it did require some numbers. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to explain you almost the method that Greek architects followed in setting out their temples, and we're going to use Hephaestus as our example. The first thing the Greek architect had to decide was on the number of columns and the overall length. So in the case of Hephaestus, the number of columns is 6 by 13. So the ratio of that is 1 to 2.17. And if you measure out the crepiduoma, the outermost footprint of the base, then you will note that it conforms to that ratio. Measured in meters, we have a length of 33.48 meters and a width of 15.43. But remember, the Greeks did not use the metric system. They measured things in Doric feet, and dactyls were the smaller unit. So, translated directly, this comes down to 102 Doric feet. And historians have thought that that shows that there was probably the intention to create a temple with a length of 100 feet. So the decision that would have been made by the ruler who wanted to create the temple was probably something like, I want a temple 100 feet long with a hexastyle facade. And with that two information, you can work out the width. Now, once the extent of the crepidoma has been set out, this is now when the real secret of their system comes into play. And that is that they used this layout to determine a module. And we've talked about modules before. But a module, to remind you, would be a certain unit which determines the measurements of a design. One of my colleagues, ex-colleagues, who is an architect, used to always say something that baffled me at first, but now I understand it. He always said that the first thing he discusses with any client is the floor tile. And that may sound odd, but what he said is that he then takes that floor tile and he uses it as a module to set out the entire house, if it's a house. And this has all sorts of advantages, but the most practical one is that if you have a wall, if the plan is set out according to this module, then you never have to cut and lose any tiles. And what does this remind you of? Well, I hope it reminds you of the tatami carpets used as a module to set out Japanese tea houses. So the Greeks worked in a similar way. They created a module. Now, how did they create the module? Well, they used the following formula, and I don't want to make this too laborious, so go and figure out why this formula works. But the module is worked out as follows. The overall length, so 100, and by the way, the end result being 102 is simply the result of error. In any building project, even today with our high technology, there is a certain percentage of error that is always allowed for. So the length would be divided by the following: the number of columns in the length times 5. And in meters, if we were to use that measurement, then we end up with more or less half a meter. We will get back to the 5 because you will understand it only a bit later, why that is important. But anyway, so that is then the module, and I'm just going to name it M. And the module then determines a number of things. First and foremost, the width of the triglyph. And sorry for the silence. Are you still there? Are you still listening? Maybe I should tell all sorts of rude jokes just to make sure that people are in fact listening to these lectures. So if I then don't receive any complaints, then I know you're not listening. Anyway, so there's a triglyph. A triglyph also has a cap. In the previous drawing I just drew the glyphs, but it also has a cap. And underneath the triglyph runs all along the frieze a narrow protruding band called the tinea. And under the triglyph, underneath the tinea, are little drops, drop-like forms. And I'm not drawing the right number, there are more of them per triglyph than I'm drawing. And these are called gutti. I almost want to say it's pronounced like slutty, but I won't. Gutti. And there's the triglyph cap. So the module determines the width of the triglyph. Its height is 1.5 times the module. So some authors describe the entire system of the Doric order in terms of the triglyph. The triglyph is the central main unit of measurement that is used to construct these buildings. And in fact, the Greeks, when they were building their temples, they created full-scale models of elements called paradigma. And these were then built on site, and they could take physical measurements of these one-to-one models. So if a triglyph was built as a paradigma, then they could measure directly from it and then measure out, for instance, the crepiduoma as increments of the triglyph width. And by the way, if you look at the word paradigma, you may recognize the word paradigm. And when we speak of a paradigm, we speak of a model of thinking that is emulated by a group of people during any given time. So, for instance, we may say that we live in an ecological paradigm, meaning that people consider the environment or ecological systems to be a way of understanding the world, even if they have personally not gotten to that conclusion. So they're following a model. So that's where the word comes from. The metope next to the triglyph is then the same height as the triglyph. So it's the metope is 1.5 modules in height. But unlike the triglyph, it is a square element. So it is, the metope is 1.5 by 1.5 modules. And the metope is often a relief. It doesn't always have to be. So in other words, it doesn't always include some sculptural element. But often these would. And in the case of this temple, the metopes tell the story of the 12 labors of Heracles. And again, beautifully illustrated here by Leroy. And if we zoom in, and if you know the myth, you will recognize some of these events. So while we're at this drawing of the entablature, you can now see how the metope itself is a square and the triglyph is one module in its width and 1.5 in its height. Also note that above each column there is a triglyph, and in between each column, or the columns, there is another one. And now you should understand where the 5 in our formula comes from. For if we have our columns, and above them we have the architrave, and then we have the frieze, and above each column we have a triglyph, and we also have a triglyph between the columns. And you can see my proportioning is out because I'm now left with a metope that isn't square. So let's resolve that by making the whole thing a bit higher. You saw Wessel van Dijk draw. If you make a mistake, just, keep calm and carry on. And now I shouldn't get carried away and start drawing every gutty just for the sheer pleasure of it. I hope, by the way, you're making these drawings with me while I'm speaking. Makes me feel less anxious. Okay, almost. We have square metopes. So what we can now see is that the interaxial spacing of the columns is determined by the module. And by the way, when we speak of the spacing of columns, we can either talk about the interaxial spacing or we can talk of intercolumnation, which refers to this, the distance between the columns. But what we now have in terms of the interaxial spacing is half a triglyph, so half a module, 1.5 for the metope, 1 for the central triglyph, 1.5 for the second metope, and then another half. And that, of course, added up gives you 5. So the interaxial spacing is 5 modules. So we've discovered yet another very important design informant for the Doric temple, and that is the interaxial spacing. So we now have our crepidoma set out. We know how many columns we have on either side. We know what the module is, and we can now start spacing those columns on the stylobate. What we can also determine is the length of the frieze, because we know that there are 13 columns if we're talking of the long side. There are 13 columns. That would mean that there would be 12 interaxial spaces. So we can say 12 times 5. But we also know that at the corners, there would be, at each corner, there would be half a triglyph that juts out beyond the axis of the column. So we would have to add half an M and another half an M. So in this example, we have a frieze width of 61 M in the long side and 26 on the short side. And that's not all. The next important piece of information that we're lacking is the lower column diameter. And there was a very simple rule for that, and that was 2m. But what now of the height of the column? So here things get a bit more complicated. The order height, in other words, the height of the from the base of the column to the top of the frieze. And for some reason, the historians, and I'm sure there's a good reason, I haven't figured it out yet, but the order height is proposed slightly differently for various temples. So sometimes they take the order height a bit higher. But anyway, that gets way too technical for us. I think I will keep it as simple as, for now, the order height from the base of the column to the top of the frieze, which indeed it is often measured as. So that is often determined with the module, and it is taken as 15, the module. So that gives you the order height. Then the entablature itself and the column height is not determined as increments of the module, but rather as fragments of the order height. So the entablature would typically be a quarter of the order height, and the column height would be the rest, so 3/4. So this is interesting because now the Greeks are using a mixture between a modular system and a proportioning system where ratios are used. So to describe the entire Greek system as being only modular would therefore be incorrect, although it is by and large a modular system. Now, what of the capital, you may ask? Well, the capital is sometimes determined with the module, and it is also 1m. Now, speaking of the capital, you will have noted, and I think I mentioned it already in first semester, that the capital consists of two parts. The top slab, which is square, is called the abacus. And underneath it sits the rounded element called the echinus, And this distinction between the two parts of the capital is further evidence of the rational way of thinking that the Greek architects strove towards, in that the square block of the abacus relates to the rectilinear lintel above it, and the rounded echinus relates to the circular drum of the column beneath it. So these two elements mediate the rectilinear condition of the lintel with the circular condition of the shaft, instead of just having one element that sits awkwardly in between the circle and the square. You may have noticed that the columns have a slight bulge to them, and I'm exaggerating it now here on the left, although only ever so slightly. And that bulge is called entasis. So it's the bulging of the column. These are not mere vertical lines perpendicular to the earth, and that is called the entasis. And this again proves the genius of the Greeks in how they attempted to create a visual impression of order. Had the columns been perfectly vertical, with a constant dimension from base to top, this would theoretically be correct, but visually not. For columns, or any vertical element for that matter, that are built in this way, visually appears to be, and I'm going to exaggerate hugely, but concave. Tricks like this in architecture is referred to as optical corrections, and the Roman author Vitruvius also discusses entasis as a Greek example of optical correction. By giving the column a bulge, it's a correction of the concave visual appearance that a straight column would have. Now, in fact, the Greek temple facade would be victim, for lack of a better word, to a similar optical illusion. If it were to be built perfectly straight with a level stereobate and stylobate, then, to exaggerate again, the temple would actually appear wrong. It would appear like I'm drawing here. And this is based on a study or a set of drawings that Bannister Fletcher did in his famous book on architecture. So that's what the temple would look like if every angle were to be perpendicular and if the crepidoma was completely level. And what the Greeks did for the entire facade was to give it, the entire thing, a bulge. And again, this is exaggerated, yet true, that the columns would taper slightly inward and the stylobate would have a bulge. So by doing this visually the temple appears to be correct. So again, I want to emphasize this ideal of creating a perfectly rational facade is not achieved through the application of cold mathematics. As I've demonstrated, the mathematical order is extremely important and present, but the architects and the builders of these temples also brought in their understanding of things like visual illusions. Another important part of the Doric temple that really gave the Greek architects sleepless nights, in terms of this strive to create visual harmony and order, occurred at the corners of the building. So if we go back to our drawing, and if we were to say that this column over here is the very last one at the end, then you may note that if the triglyph, as it is supposed to be, is situated exactly above the column, then, and if the frieze were to end with the triglyph, then one ends up with a rather awkward gap. And this awkward gap is what is referred to the Doric corner problem. And this is a very good example of what one can call an architectural problem. And something I discussed with Professor Barker yesterday is surprisingly few of our students understand what we mean when we say, what is the architectural problem? For there's no engineering problem here. The architrave sits comfortably on the column, everything stands, there's no issue. But here is an architectural problem. If the logic of the facade is taken through, then we have this awkward visual end. So again, it would be interesting for me to know whether you find this ending of the entablature awkward as I've drawn it here. If you do find it awkward, you are only so slightly Greek and a bit obsessive, and those are all necessary qualities, I think, for an architect to have. So they had to resolve the corner problem. And it was also very much at the end a visual game, and they did various options in various temples, so one can write, and indeed articles have been written just on this topic. So the one solution, and perhaps it's necessary to state, well, the obvious solution would be to simply lengthen the entablature and not have the triglyph at the end. In other words, one would have a narrow strip of stone that is undecorated next to the triglyph. But that is quite awkward if one thinks of it in 3 dimensions. So instead of having a triglyph on both sides of the corner, you're now going to have this little interruption in the corner. And again, I think it's one of those things, you either get this or you don't. You're either sympathetic to the Greeks for being bothered about this, or not at all. And I can bet you most engineers wouldn't get, well, what's all the fuss about? Just build the thing. And indeed, the Romans, when they interpreted the Doric order, did exactly this. So you'll see in later classical buildings, you often do have that little unadorned piece at the corner, because that's the most simple solution. Then you don't need to alter the mathematical precision of the system. But the Greeks, as I said, were not satisfied with that solution. So I wonder if you can think of another solution or solutions to the problem. Well, as with many things Greek, the solution is rather simple. So to prevent the awkward gap I was talking about at the edge, and to maintain the triglyph at the end of the frieze, they did something that is now referred to as corner contraction. So what they basically did is they made the interaxial space between the corner at the column with the corner next to it smaller than all the other columns. And now I just need to erase my arrow, because no matter what did Wessel say, don't just keep calm and carry on. So this interaxial spacing is less than the 5m we were talking about. And why that is done is because the triglyph has been moved to the end. So you can see the triglyph on the corner is not centered with the axis of the column, the corner column. And if one were to simply move the triglyph to the end and not shorten this distance, then the metope, the second last metope, and if you don't get this, you can try this on, you can try it on your own, but that metope would have been awkwardly rectilinear. So the corner contraction helps to negate that, and indeed you will see that the metopes on the edges are slightly more rectilinear than they are square to make up for that gap. So it's a good example, the corner problem, of the Greeks' obsession with making things look right, even though they may not always be theoretically correct. Other things that, now I'm just doodling for the fun of it, other things that is interesting in terms of this is that the Greeks didn't try to solve technical problems. They didn't try to build the largest temple or create the largest span that they could imagine. That's something that you'll see with the Romans and the Egyptians, of course, as well. Once they perfected this system of the Doric order, they were actually quite happy to leave it at that. They tweaked it, but even when it, for instance, became technologically possible to create larger spans, when the stone technology allowed for that, they were not interested in creating larger interaxial spacings, because they felt that it didn't look right. So the Greeks are definitely not a form follows function, didn't follow that kind of mentality. And if you think about the function of this building, it's very easy to house a statue functionally. It can easily be achieved. But they chose to rather convey an idea and create that rational veil that I was talking about earlier. So now that you understand what the main components of a Doric temple is, and you understand their motivation, what they were trying to achieve, and you also understand how they achieved it through a modular system, we can now quickly look at some of the origins of this building type. Where did it come from? So the Doric order and that level of refinement that you saw didn't happen overnight. So the development of the Doric order can be summarized to have taken place in three main phases. The first, we can talk of the temple as a house, or oikos, which I'll explain just now. The second phase was monumentalization. And here I am really referring to size. And the third phase is refinement. So by looking at these three phases, we can understand why the temples look the way they do. So the reasons why these temples that stand out in the countryside, there where something important happened, there where the Greeks believed God to have done something, to have dwelled, rational structures in contrast to the chaos of visible nature, experienced as places from the outside. Rituals occur at the altar, and one must see these temples and think of them in terms of the Greek landscape. But because the reason why they look like houses, and almost the archetypical house, if I had to ask my daughter to draw a house, she would probably draw something with a pitch roof and a rectilinear base. And the reason why they look like that is because the first temples were in the form of shrines, as seen here in the bottom right, that were directly informed by early Greek houses, as seen on the left. So these drawings are of dwellings found at Perakora from the 8th century BC, and you can see it has a pitch roof, and it is entered from one side, and it has a apse or semicircular ending. And in the translation to the shrine, we find a pitch roof, but now the entrance is being celebrated with two columns. The entrance is still from the one side, and you will see that is now on a base. So you can now see where the crepidoma comes from. A Greek house, or Greek for house, is oikos. And as a word, it has more depth than that, and it relates to home and place. The philosopher Roger Scruton, a conservative philosopher, coined the term oikophobia, and he coined that term to describe people who have a phobia or a hatred or a distaste for their own home. People who criticize and keep criticizing everything that is of their own place. He mentioned that is, or coined that as oikophobia. So that is quite simple. Then we must also take into account two other very important influences, which then transformed the oikos into the temple as we know it. The first is, on the left, the Egyptian temples. You'll remember that in the New Kingdom temples, like this one at Hatshepsut that we looked at, the Egyptians started to use colonnades as a means to articulate planes with a rhythmic pattern of shadows. So instead of having those vast dead facades of the older Egyptian buildings, these ones are now punctured by a rhythm of shadows. You'll also remember at Hatshepsut, but even earlier at Saqqara, the Egyptians started to create columns at a monumental scale using stone, and that was a technological breakthrough that influenced the Greeks. And they also had fluted columns. So their columns didn't have the entasis as clearly defined as the Greeks did, but these were two very important influences on the Greeks. The next important influence is the Mycenaean megaron that I referred to. And I drew that quick sketch, but here now you can see the plan. And there is the hearth, the fireplace, open to the sky, surrounded by the four columns. But the important thing that we didn't see here in the shrine, where it was only one space on the inside, is this idea of having a series of spaces that leads from the outside towards the inside. So there's a series of thresholds before you get into the more sacred area. We also see things, for instance, like the anta and the columns in anta. And you know what those are by now. So from the Egyptians, the use of colonnades and the fluted stone monumental columns, and from the megaron we find this tripartite spatial division. Now the next phase, the monumental phase, can best be seen in this example, and it's the first temple of Hera at Samos. And what we're seeing now is almost as if the shrine, the oikos, which was a compact building, has been lengthened as a means to monumentalize the temple, to show that it is an important place. It's not just like any other dwelling of the citizen. Now look at the image on the left here, where you have a central colonnade of lean timber posts. So obviously when you're working with timber, you're not working with the stereotomic mass of stone. And you will see here that on plan, the colonnade is in line with the icon, the statue. And that's quite an awkward spatial configuration to have, with a colonnade in the center. And note, by the way, the altar here on the outside. Again, reminding us that the altar was where the ritual took place, even in these earlier temples. So we see the size is increasing. Now, why would this building be so linear, so thin? Well, that simply has to do with the construction technique that was being used, the timber. They were not able to create a span, a roof span, wider than that. So the only way to make something bigger is to make it longer. The other thing that's now interesting is at the same site, this building itself was adapted. And if you look carefully, you will now see that the plan at the bottom here has another ingredient that you know became characteristic of the Doric temple, and that is the peripteral colonnade that wraps around the temple. Now here it isn't peripteral, but we see the first signs of that idea. And it is thought that in this instance, it was purely added to the building. If we had to draw a quick section here, it was added as a means to protect the roof, the walls, because the walls were made of clay. So we haven't yet seen the influence of the Egyptians affect this specific phase of the temple construction, because they were still building walls with clay brick. So when it rains, walls like that would soon deteriorate. So the thatch roof, and the roof was made of thatch, was extended beyond the wall and supported by a line of columns to protect the roof. So a very practical solution again to this version of Hiera, where you had an exposed wall, which then became an influential part of the aesthetic of the temples. The last phase was refinement. And it is here that we see that elements like the triglyph, the metope, was introduced. And part of this process of refinement had to do with the change in materials. Notice here how on this elevation of the temple of Apollo at Thermon, and now we're in about 650 BC, we see that the slope of the pediment of the roof has decreased. It's a flatter pitch than this thatch roof at Hiera. And again, for a simple reason, they were now using terracotta tiles, so it was a technological improvement, rather than thatch. And of course, terracotta is much more durable, and part of monumentalization, part of showing that something is of great importance, is often to make it very durable. But you may know from construction first year that if you have roof tiles, you don't need a very steep pitch roof, although it won't be flat either. So there we see why the pediment has the profile that it does. It was because of a change in material. On the plan here, we still see that awkward existence of the colonnade in the center. We now see the opistodomos, sort of an early example of that, introduced. And we see how we have now a complete peripteral series of columns that wrap around the cella. In this section, we can still see that some parts of this construction is timber, like the timber structure used at Hiera. So it's now a mixture of timber construction and terracotta. But in this facade, the Temple of Apollo at Thermon, we're starting to see the temple as we got to know it. And now compare that to the elevation of the Temple of Hiera, where the pitch was much steeper due to the thatch which needs a steep slope, because otherwise the thatch would rot. And also look at how the timber construction at Thermon has been refined from the one at Hiera. At Hiera we have slender columns that don't taper, and you will see that the capitals are very wide, as they need to be to support the beams at the top. And here you can see something interesting, and these black squares, they are the ends of the rafters, the timber rafters that are there to create this interior ceiling. And I'm mentioning this specifically because there's this long-standing theory that the Doric order was a skeuomorphic translation of the earlier timber constructions. You know what skeuomorphic means, so I don't need to explain it. And the typical example that is always given is the triglyph, which is then a monumentalization of those rafters. So in this image, which is again of a timber temple, which has been refined from the earlier one at Hiera, but we can see how, and this is conjectural, they're speculating here, how the beam is held in place by pegs at the bottom. And those you will recognize as the gatti. So the idea here is that the rafters became the stone triglyphs, and the gatti is a skeuomorphic remnant of the pegs that kept the rafter in place. Now, it's not exactly true, or let me rather say it this way, it's not certain that everything in the Doric order is simply a stone interpretation of earlier timber structures. Some have gone further and speculated, for instance, that the gatti are actually symbolic of drops of blood, because these places were places of sacrifice, and that blood would have dripped down some of the structural elements, and that those were cast in stone, as it were. So we will never quite know the exact truth, but we know that there were earlier versions, we know that there were specific influences, and we can say that there were three stages in the development of the Doric order that gave us buildings like the one we studied earlier in the session and the one shown here, the Temple of Artemis. Next week, we're going to look at the temple in its setting, and we're going to understand how it was experienced spatially. Thank you.